On July 9th, 1985, a quiet and wealthy enclave in Naples, Florida, found itself in the middle of a media frenzy as press from around the world descended on the town seeking to uncover fresh new details about the shocking death of a widowed heiress and her son. It wasn't just their deaths that captured the attention of the nation and beyond, it was the horrific way they had been killed. Margaret Benson and her son Scott were killed in a car bombing in their own driveway. Margaret's only daughter, Lynn, was also in the car and was so severely injured in the same explosion that it was weeks before investigators could get her official statement about the incident. But when they did, Lynn pulled back the veil of privilege and wealth to reveal the family's soft white underbelly, scarred with dark family secrets, lies, decades of manipulation, violence, addiction, and greed. Join us as we dissect the Benson family murders on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes and bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
And I've seen the movie Backdraft at least twice.
This is my husband, ladies and gentlemen.
It's all legal.
Yes, it's all legal. So, you guys may have noticed Jenny's not here. I just want to make it clear, this is not a hostile takeover. Jenny needed to bow out because she just had a lot on her plate right now, and she did encourage us to keep the podcast going. I don't want to do a long intro, but please do remember you can reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Crime to Burn, or the app formerly known as Twitter, X. Or you can send us emails at crimetoburn@gmail.com. The most helpful thing you can do for our now newly relaunched podcast is give this episode a positive comment on whatever platform you use to listen and tell all your friends. Let's get started, shall we? Let's start by going through a quick cast of characters that we're going to be talking about today, because I think that's going to help everyone sort of keep things straight as we go through it. So the first person we need to talk about is Margaret Benson. She was a wealthy tobacco heiress, widow of Edward Benny Benson, and the matriarch of this little family. She had 3 children: Lynn Benson Kendall, Stephen Benson, and Scott Benson. So Margaret, Stephen, Lynn, and Scott are mom, 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Margaret, Lynn, and Scott were in the car when the first bomb went off. And then the only other person we really are going to talk a lot about this episode is a man named Wayne Kerr, and he was the Benson family attorney. You got it?
Yeah, I'm tracking so far.
Okay. Do you need me to do like a whiteboard with like the red strings and...
Probably be helpful. Go ahead and get that stuff. I'll wait.
I don't have a whiteboard. Or thread.
There's one upstairs. In the kitchen, you should know where that is.
Oh yeah, there's one up there. I don't know, it seems like a long walk. Let's just plow ahead. If we need it, I can go get it. Besides, our audience can't see it.
They can see it with their ears.
Before we get started, I'm going to put all my sources in the show notes. I did read all of the court transcripts for this trial, and that is a lot of court transcripts. I also did my very best to corroborate all the research that I am putting forth here through more than one source. This particular case was really sketch in the media. It was such a sensationalized case that any little rumor or detail seemed to make it into the news, and then it would get picked up by, like, every news network, even though a lot of that stuff wasn't true. Like, for example, there are several news stories that reported that Margaret Benson was heir to the Benson and Hedges tobacco fortune. That is not the case.
I would have guessed that.
Yeah, a lot of people thought that, but it wasn't. She was actually heiress to a company called Lancaster Leaf. There are two sources that I think were very helpful, and I recommend them both with caveats. The first one is a book called Blood Relations by John Greenya, but the caveat is that this book was told with the full cooperation of Lynn Benson Kendall, the survivor of the bombing, but she also had a financial stake in this book and received royalties. So while it's a great look inside the family from the inside perspective, there may have been parts of the book that were portrayed maybe a little more rosy than they happened in real life. And so I think it was a great book. I didn't necessarily find anything in the book that I felt was just completely inaccurate, but I did find some of the information in the book was presented differently in other sources.
Just trying to hang on to dignity or something, probably.
Yeah, and that's totally understandable.
Yeah.
I do want to say, though, that as we get into, especially into the court case, we're going to talk about a lot of inconsistencies, specifically between the statement Carolyn made to police right after the bombing and her statements later on. We're going to talk a lot about those inconsistencies and what they mean, but I just want to make it really clear. Carolyn is a victim here. I do not believe that she was in any way involved in the crime. The police initially were looking at everybody. But I want to make sure that when we talk about inconsistencies in her statement, that it's clear that I'm not suggesting that she ever intentionally misled police or lied or anything like that. There are reasons why there may be inconsistencies, and we're going to talk about them, but I just want to put that disclaimer out there because I absolutely cherish not being involved in lawsuits.
I also cherish that.
And I believe she's still alive. The other book that I read that I thought was absolutely stellar is called Money to Burn by Michael Mewshaw. Now, while the John Greenya book is told more from the perspective of Carolyn, it is a little bit more, what's the right word?
Did you pick up the whole case because that book was called Money to Burn and it sounded like Crime to Burn? And then you built this whole thing around that?
No, I didn't even realize that until you just pointed it out.
That's amazing.
It never occurred to me. I had to buy both books used, though. I couldn't find them new. The book that Carolyn participated in is definitely a little more sympathetic toward the prosecution angle. The book by Michael Mewshaw, I think the investigation part was done very unbiased. And even though Michael Mewshaw did speak with Carolyn multiple times, he would not agree to her requirements for financial compensation in return for her cooperation with his book, because he felt like that would take away his ability to be completely unbiased.
Oh, I thought you were going to say his ability to be, like, financially secure.
Maybe that, too. I don't really know. But the thing is that as he was writing this book, it's clear that he had most access during the trial to the defense. So there's definitely parts of the book where he seems much more sympathetic to the defense side. So the books are actually pretty good counterparts to each other, I think. Like, they contrast.
Yeah. You get two sides of the spectrum.
But I want to make it clear, he never says whether or not he actually thinks that the defendant in this case is innocent or guilty. But he does say that he doesn't think the defendant got a fair trial. And I gotta admit, he's got some good points. But we'll get to those. But those are the two sources that I used the most heavily, besides, obviously, the court documents. Just again, if you do dive in and research this case, just know that the press on this case is littered with errors and rumors that were presented as truth, so do so with a very discerning mind.
I'm pretty interested to hear it. I know you've spent a lot of time.
So, it was the summer of 1985. This was the year Michael Jordan was named Rookie of the Year in the NBA. Ronald Reagan was president. Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. Careless Whisper is climbing the charts.
Wow.
USA for Africa records that song We Are the World. Remember that?
Yes, with Michael Jackson.
And Coca-Cola, a few months before this, rolled out New Coke to flaming criticism and then rapidly announced that they were bringing back Coca-Cola Classic.
Rightfully deserved criticism.
Yes. And then this occurred on July 9th, 1985. So I'm going to tell you what the number 2 and the number 3 songs were. I'm going to see if you can guess the number 1 song, but I can give you some hints. So,
okay.
The number 2 song was Sussudio by Phil Collins, and the number 3 song was Raspberry Beret by the artist formerly known as Prince and his Revolution.
Those are my clues.
So the number 1 song was by a band that I've heard of, and I'm pretty sure most people that were alive in the 80s have heard of. But I'd never actually heard of this song. But it is sort of ironic. In a dark way.
What band is it?
It's Duran Duran. And the song was written for a movie.
Bond, James Bond.
That is the movie it was written for. Do you remember the name of the song?
View to a Kill.
View to a Murder, yes.
View to a Murder?
Maybe it was View to a Kill. Maybe I just typed it wrong.
You're a dork. That's View to a Kill.
View to a Kill. I don't remember this song.
Actually, I'm a dork. You're a nerd. But it's View to a Kill.
Okay. I played it on YouTube because I thought I was alive in 85. I mean...
That even rhymes.
It does. And I remember a lot of these events. I remember most of the songs on the charts. But I didn't remember this one. And when I played it, no recollection of it at all. Alright, so the number 1 movie this week. I'll tell you the number 2 movie was Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Number 3 was Cocoon. Number 4 was Rambo First Blood Part 2. Number 5 was Pale Rider. And then a little further down the charts was St. Elmo's Fire at number 8. Goonies, the best movie ever made, was number 10. And Desperately Seeking Susan was 19. Do you want to take a stab at the number 1 movie? Or do you want a hint?
I don't know what it was, but I hope it was written by Stanley Kubrick.
I'll give you a hint. Calvin Klein underwear.
Back to the Future.
Yes. I knew you would get it from that. Okay. So on July 9th, 1985, Wayne Kerr did not wake up in his mother's high school bedroom wearing nothing but his Calvin Klein skivvies. Instead, he woke up in a spare bedroom at the home of his client, Margaret Benson. Now, Wayne had been Mrs. Benson's attorney for about 4 years since the death of her husband. And during that time, he had become very, very good friends with Mrs. Benson's son, Stephen. In fact, they were such good friends that Stephen was best man in Kerr's wedding.
Is that normal for a lawyer to...
Are you really asking me what's normal? Have I ever done anything normal?
I don't know. You were never a bridesmaid at your lawyer's wedding.
This is true. I don't know. I don't know how much time rich people spend with their attorneys, so maybe it's normal?
Maybe if I did cooler stuff, I'd need to hang out with a lawyer all the time.
I just thought it was weird that he was staying at the house of his client. Like, if I had needed a lawyer to come and visit me from another state, I don't think I would be like, yeah, I'll put you up in the guest room.
Live-in lawyer.
Yeah, that seemed weird. Because Wayne didn't live in Florida where Mrs. Benson lived. He was actually based out of Philadelphia. But he flew down to Florida, and this was his second trip this year, flying down to Florida, because his previous trip, he had tried to do Mrs. Benson's taxes. Now, Mrs. Benson owned multiple businesses with her son, Stephen. But when Wayne had flown down previously to do her taxes, he found that the books for the businesses were atrocious. They were missing entries, they were missing checks completely, they had no balance carried forward.
They didn't have an accountant.
No, and Stephen, not a good accountant. Or not a good pretending to be an accountant even. So he hadn't been able to do her 1984 taxes yet. It's now July. Stephen was supposed to have taken this period of time between his visits to update the books, get them all cleaned up. Unfortunately, they found that he had actually not accomplished that when he arrived, but he flew down on July 7th, and Mrs. Benson immediately took him to view some land that she was purchasing. And then on July 8th, he went with her to the security business that she and Stephen owned together to get those accounting records, which is when they found that they still weren't all nice and cleaned up. In addition, Mrs. Benson had told him on the phone before he came down that she had learned some things about the businesses that she owned with Stephen and about Stephen's handling of those businesses that made her really concerned. And he wanted Wayne's help in figuring out, number one, if what she had found out was true, and number two, what her options were. In addition, Wayne had to have a uncomfortable conversation with Mrs. Benson. He'd already explained this to her, but he needed to have a more in-depth conversation about it. You see, when her husband died, she inherited a $10 million fortune, and that was in 1985 dollars. So today that would be the purchasing power of something closer to $30 million. However, in the last year and a half, she had blown through $1.5 million. And he was worried that she really needed to rein in her spending or she was going to be broke in 6 or 7 years.
That's a lot of tacos. You could get extra cheese on those tacos.
You could do a lot. Now, I suspect that given the information that he and Margaret found out the day before and his concerns about having to do taxes with incomplete bookkeeping and the uncomfortable conversations that were on the horizon, he was feeling less than positive about the day that lay ahead of him. But he couldn't have possibly guessed how traumatic his day was about to become. Now, as Kerr was getting dressed, he knew that Mrs. Benson's son Stephen was due to arrive at the house about 7:30 a.m. to go with Mrs. Benson and her daughter and her youngest son to the new lots where she was planning to build a brand new shiny mansion. Initially, the mansion was planned to be about 17,000 square feet, which is insanely large as it is, but she kept making tweaks to the plans, and it had ballooned up to, by some reports, up to 28,000 square feet.
Nice.
So Stephen was still dressing when he looked out the window and saw Stephen Benson pull up right at 7:30 in his beige work van. Now this was a surprise, not just to Wayne, but to everybody, because Stephen was notoriously late for everything, especially anything that started early in the morning. Not a morning person. So Wayne quickly pulls on the rest of his clothes and runs down to the kitchen, and he finds Mrs. Benson and Lynn already in the kitchen, so he begins hunting for coffee, and all he finds is Sanka.
Gross.
Now, for those of you that weren't alive in the 80s, Sanka is decaffeinated instant coffee. To borrow a phrase from Ani DeFranco, it's basically water dressed in brown. So Stephen walks in, sees Wayne begrudgingly making himself a cup of Sanka, and he decides he cannot stand by while his friend is subjected to the abomination of instant decaffeinated coffee.
That's being a good friend. But really, friends don't let friends drink instant decaffeinated coffee. You've got a deeper problem if you're doing instant coffee that's also decaffeinated. Something hurt you before that. You need to figure out the root cause.
I agree.
And address it.
So Stephen heroically offers to run down to the convenience store down the street and get some real coffee and some donuts for everybody. Now, when he arrived at 7:30, Lynn, and Margaret were supposed to have been dressed and ready to go, and Scott was supposed to be going with them, but at this point Scott was still asleep, and Lynn and Margaret were still in their pajamas. So Stephen's like, y'all go get dressed, somebody go haul my 21-year-old brother out of bed, and be ready to go when I get back with coffee. So Carolyn and her mom get dressed, Scott gets up, gets dressed, Wayne settles in at a table to work on untangling the books, and the Bensons' housekeeper arrived, Marty Taylor, and she didn't arrive until 8:30. Now remember, Stephen arrived right at 7:30. So even if they spent some time talking in the kitchen, 8:30 was already an exceptionally long trip to the convenience store that was just a couple miles down the road. In fact...
Hey, it takes time to make good coffee.
He was going to a convenience store, not a Starbucks.
I said good coffee.
Oh. We're going to get sued.
You're going to get sued. We're going to get divorced before that happens.
Anyway, so by 8:30, when the maid arrives, he's already been gone for close to an hour. But even after she arrives, there's jokes made about how long it's taking him to get back. Stephen finally returns, he passes out the coffee, gets everyone a donut, and then starts rushing everyone out to the car. So, Stephen...
So he came back with the coffee?
He did come back with the coffee.
Oh, okay. I thought something bad was happening because he wasn't back yet.
No.
And I'm waiting for a car bomb to go off, so I thought, No,
not yet.
All right.
So, Stephen... Oh, and he had not driven his work van to get the coffee. He had driven his mother's Suburban.
Why?
He said his work van was low on gas.
Did they have company cards in 85? Like fleet fuel cards?
I don't know.
Or was that might be older than fleet fuel cards?
I couldn't tell you.
Ancient history.
Anyway, Stephen, Scott, and Margaret all walk out of the house together, and Carolyn is several steps behind them because she doesn't drink coffee, so she was getting herself a drink, and she was rolling up and carrying all of the house plans for her mother's mansion because they're going to the lot to stake out where this mansion's going to be on the lot to get the best view and all the things.
Right.
Now, when Carolyn walks out of the house, she was surprised because they're all piling in her mother's Suburban, which she expected, but Scott was sitting in the driver's seat. Now, Scott is the 21-year-old youngest brother. Stephen's in his 30s, Carolyn's in her 40s. So Scott is not usually the one to drive when they're all going somewhere together. Usually it would be Stephen that would drive. In addition, Carolyn usually sat in the front seat because she got carsick very easily, but her mother was already in the front seat, so she decided, we're not going very far, I'll just sit in the back seat. And she went and got in behind Scott. At this point, Stephen was reportedly half in, half out of the back seat behind his mother. And while Carolyn was putting her drink down and getting the plans in the car, Mama Benson asked, all right, who's got the keys? Now, if you were sitting in the back seat of the car and somebody asks who had the keys and you had them, how would you typically give them to the driver?
You said he was half in, half out.
Yeah.
Not sitting in the back seat.
Right, but he's already got one cheek on the...
Oh, he's half in, half out on a vertical plane, not a horizontal plane.
Right, so...
He's not got his torso in the car and feet on the ground.
No, in fact, there was actually a really funny, drawn-out discussion in court about how much of his butt cheek was on the seat.
These are the things I think people want to know. You probably wouldn't have mentioned that.
That's why you're here, to draw this information out.
So how much of the butt cheek was...
I don't even know, but he was...
Did they measure his butt cheek?
I don't think they measured his butt cheek. But let's just go with one cheek on, one cheek off. That seems reasonable.
He's doing a one cheek sneak in the back seat.
So if he was trying to give the keys to somebody in the front seat, how would you normally do that?
So are they paying attention to me or not?
Let's say, sure.
And you just hand them to him.
What if they weren't paying attention?
You smack him upside the back of the head and be like, hey, I'm talking.
No.
And then you can just throw them at their face for ignoring you.
Well, Stephen didn't do either of those. Instead, he got out of the vehicle, walked around the back of the vehicle. Carolyn at this point is just getting in after sitting all her stuff down. So he boosts his sister into her seat and goes to close her door. And she's like, no, leave the door open, it's hot. Until we're leaving, I'll close it then. So he leaves her door open. And then he hands the keys through the open window to Scott and says, hey, I forgot my tape measure inside. I'll be right back. And heads off. So as Stephen is jogging back towards the house to go get his tape measure, which he needs for unknown reasons, Wayne Kerr is inside, looking through these accounting books and presumably enjoying his very highfalutin convenience store coffee, when he hears an explosion that rocks the house and he hears debris hitting the windows. Now here's something that I found odd. After the explosion, when investigators questioned Wayne Kerr about what he was doing and what his initial thoughts were, he said that he presumed that one of the Lotuses had blown up again, which made me really scratch my head for a couple reasons. Number one, how many Lotuses did the Bensons own? And the answer is 2. And the second question is, were Lotuses, like, prone to blowing up or something? Because
I don't think so. But even if they were, how many times can you blow up a Lotus?
I don't know. I was so confused by that. But so I read that and I was like, well, that was weird. And then I just kind of kept going. But then later on in my research, they talked to a extended family member and they asked him what his initial thought was when somebody told him that there had been an explosion. And he also said, well, my first thought was I thought one of the Lotuses exploded. And I was like, what?
Like, come by on Tuesday. The Lotus explodes about noon.
Like, was this a Lotus problem or specifically a Benson problem?
I don't think Lotus had a problem like that.
I don't think so either, because I'm probably on some sort of watch list now because I Googled.
Another watch list.
I Googled a lot about whether or not Lotuses are prone to exploding in 1985, and I didn't get any satisfactory results. So if anyone knows whether or not, if anyone had a Lotus and can tell us whether or not they were prone to exploding, that would be helpful. Also, before we get back on track, a quick aside. Remember that number 1 movie?
Footloose.
Back to the Future?
Right.
The car in Back to the Future was what?
It was a DeLorean.
It was a DeLorean. And DeLorean was designed by John DeLorean. But he actually...
Is that why they called it a DeLorean?
It is. But he actually contracted with another car company to produce it. And do you know what car company that was?
Alfa Romeo.
Lotus. So, I just thought that was an interesting tidbit. Everything ties back to the Explodey Lotus.
Okay.
But it sounds weird to say they had 2 Lotus.
Hey, look, yeah. Yeah, this guy has 2 Lotus parked in his driveway.
It just sounds wrong. So I'm going with Lotuses.
Sounds dumb.
And all of you editors out there can just cringe. All right, back to Wayne Kerr. And his presumption about exploding cars. So Wayne rushed over to the window near where he was working, but from that vantage point, he couldn't see the driveway. So then he starts rapidly making his way toward the foyer. And as he does, Stephen bursts through the front door yelling, "Call an ambulance, call an ambulance." So Kerr never makes it to the front door and reroutes toward the phone to dial 911. Now, all of you kids out there, this was back in the days when your phone wasn't in your pocket. It was like attached to a wall.
And unless you had the really long curly cord.
You were stuck next to the wall too, yeah. So Wayne dials 911, and as would be expected, the dispatcher has a lot of questions that Wayne can't answer because he doesn't actually know what has happened. So Stephen is standing with him, but Stephen is freaking out. He's shaking, he's having trouble talking. So finally Wayne shoves the phone at Marty Taylor, the housekeeper, and he goes outside to see what's going on. Stephen goes with Wayne. Now when Wayne first steps out the front door and sees the carnage, he can't handle it. He's the kind of guy that faints at the sight of blood. And there was already people that were tending to the casualties. So he decides his best course of action isn't going to be to go over and try to help, because he's liable to pass out and become a patient himself. So he instead focuses on trying to calm Stephen down and comfort Stephen. Taylor's inside still talking to emergency services, and suddenly there's a second explosion from the Suburban. Again, shakes the house.
From the same car?
From the same car. Now, we mentioned that when Kerr went outside, there was already people tending to the casualties. But who were these people? Well, Mrs. Benson's home set in a gated community on the golf course. And there's people playing golf on the third hole, which was right next to her house, when the explosions happened. So 2 golfers, Charles Meyer and Fred Merrill, run to see what's happened and if they could help. As we know, they find a scene of absolute carnage in the driveway. Charles Meyer first goes to the passenger side of the torn-apart Suburban, and he finds the body of Margaret Benson on the ground, and he doesn't know if she is dead or alive, but one thing is for sure. The car is fully engulfed in flames, so he grabs her ankles and tries to pull her back away from the vehicle. Meanwhile, on the other side of the car, Fred Merrill, the other golfer, who had actually been Mrs. Benson's realtor at one point, goes over to the driver's side and he finds the body of Scott Benson on the ground, but what takes his full attention is that Carol Lynn is on the ground outside the Suburban, and not only is she alive, but she is actually conscious and trying to remove her badly burned shirt and screaming for help and screaming that she was burning. Now she is sitting right next to a fully engulfed car fire. So he immediately starts trying to help her move away from the vehicle. As his golf partner on the other side is dragging Mrs. Benson away, that's when the second bomb explodes. In fact, the Meyer, the man that was pulling Miss Benson, he was walking backwards as he was pulling her away. And he tripped over some landscaping, so he was already falling backwards. And the fact that he was already falling when the second bomb exploded may have possibly saved his life, but it at least saved him from more serious injury, because he sustained many shrapnel wounds that ended up being like glancing blows on his chest.
Like Bullet Time in that one movie.
I don't know what you're talking about.
That movie with that one actor. The Matrix.
Oh, The Matrix.
The bullets all come past him. He's like,
Well, he did have to get stitches, but all of the shrapnel was sort of like glancing blows on his chest. But if he'd been upright, they probably would have embedded in his chest and torso, and he would have been much more badly injured.
Ouch.
Now, Fred Merrill, the one that was trying to pull Carol Lynn away from the car, he was injured by shrapnel. In fact, he even lost the end of his nose, and the explosion knocked him off his feet, and he actually landed on top of Carol Lynn. And so now we have Carol Lynn is injured, 2 golfers are injured, Mrs. Benson is dead, and Scott Benson is dead.
It's not a happy story.
It's not. It's really tough. Now, paramedics arrived, and obviously their first priority is Carol Lynn. And she actually told she told authorities later that she was angry that the paramedics didn't even try to help Scott, because from her vantage point, she thought that he looked not that badly damaged and that she just saw some blood coming from his mouth. But this was either like trauma insulating her from awful memories, or she had a very different vantage point than everybody else.
People don't remember things like that really well all the time, and it's probably for the best in a lot of cases.
Scott would have been killed immediately. His skull had been cracked open by shrapnel, and his brain was exposed. So he would have died instantly. There's nothing paramedics could have done for him. Margaret was extremely badly injured. I'm not going to go through the condition of her body because it's just too gruesome, but suffice it to say that she passed away. And Carol Lynn was obviously severely injured. Now, paramedics did check out Stephen Benson, but he was unscathed, because when the first bomb exploded, he had been headed back into the house, and when the second bomb exploded, he had been just heading back out of the house. So Wayne Kerr tried to convince him to go ahead and go to the hospital and get checked out, thinking that he's probably at least in shock, and maybe he has some internal injuries or something that you can't see, but he refused. He did not want to go to the hospital. Now, at this point, there's obviously complete chaos. There's a torn-apart Suburban, there's bystanders, there's injured people, and then there's the garbage man. Now, he wanted to be useful in the wake of these 2 explosions and the now multiple injured people on the scene, and he noticed that this fully involved Suburban fire was really close to Stephen's work van, and so he took it upon himself to take the keys and start a vehicle in the driveway of a home that had just been targeted with 2 car bombs to relocate it to a safer location. This man either has balls of steel or he just wasn't thinking.
Nobody exactly puts out a how-to manual for how to react to a car bombing scenario.
Well, maybe somebody should. And for our listeners, in case you ever happen upon a car bomb, don't start any other nearby vehicles. They could also be bombed. Just leave them. Let the police do their job.
Hit the deck and take cover.
Yeah, stay away. Stay away. Anyway, but you know what? He was safe. Nothing bad happened, so I guess yay to the garbage man for saving the van.
No vans were harmed.
All right, the first responding officer, he said that his very first impression of the scene was that the Suburban looked like it had been torn apart like a beer can that had just been peeled open. And he did talk to Stephen and Wayne Kerr initially. And what was surprising to him, and not just to him, but to almost all the witnesses on the scene, was that when Stephen was asked if he wanted to go with Carolyn to the hospital or be taken to the hospital, Stephen said no. He did not want to leave the house. Now, this could be because he's in shock. This could be because maybe he felt unsafe. His entire family has now been targeted and he doesn't want to go to another public location.
He probably needs to change his pants.
He might need to change his pants. But whether or not this was odd behavior, it's hard to say because Stephen was an odd guy. So was this really out of character for him? I mean, he was described as never really fitting in, never being able to let loose, never really fully expressing his emotions.
Doesn't want to go to the movies with you, doesn't want to go to the hospital.
And we don't know what his relationship to Carolyn was. And we don't know if he needs clean pants. So maybe there's more to the story. So to answer that question, we're going to go back and talk about what we know about this family. So Margaret Benson was the daughter of tobacco industry scion Harry Hitchcock.
Whoa. Sorry. Juvenile things.
Now, Harry had been born in Baltimore, Maryland, and as a young adult, he got a job working for a tobacco company as an assistant bookkeeper. And he worked really hard, and he climbed the ranks, and eventually he was offered the opportunity to take a job in tobacco sales. And he took it. And this was an interesting choice because Harry knew nothing about tobacco. He didn't smoke, and he never would. Now, he went into sales, but he didn't try to put on airs. He actually told all of his customers that he really didn't know anything about tobacco other than what was on like the sales sheet information. But he was just really honest with people and upfront, and that won over people's trust, and they liked him. So he was really successful in this company.
Salesman of the year.
In fact, he was so successful that the company offered him the opportunity to go and open a subsidiary business called Lancaster Leaf in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
You learn the secret to sell yourself beyond your product.
Now, Harry said that while other tobacco men were focusing on trying to find the best and most expensive and exotic tobacco for fancy cigars, he noticed a lot more Chevys on the road than Cadillacs. Harry's focused on making affordable smokes for the common man, and this would prove to be exceptionally smart as the country was just coming out of the Great Depression. Now, because he was in sales, Harry was on the road constantly. He was on the road more than he was home. So he missed a lot of opportunity to spend time with his family when his children were young. He put in really long hours, hundreds of thousands of miles on his company car because he traveled all up and down the East Coast and as far west as Texas. But he could see that this little company that he was starting up was really starting to gain some traction. So Harry made a decision that because he was probably eventually going to pass away before his wife did, and he didn't want his family to have to wait for him to die to reap the rewards of all of his hard work.
How do you know that?
He didn't. He was wrong. But
oh yeah.
But that was his presumption. So what he did was he took all of his stock in Lancaster Leaf and he divided it 3 ways between his wife and his 2 daughters, Margaret and Janet Lynn. Ultimately, he did not know whether or not the stock would ever be worth anything one day, but he went ahead and did it, and ultimately this decision would prove to be a contributing factor in this tragedy.
I thought that made him pretty cool. I didn't realize that was going to start a tragedy.
Well, one thing that I mean, Harry was still pretty cool because one thing everyone said about him was that he was just not impressed by money. He lived a comfortable life, but he was not into extravagant expressions of his wealth. He really couldn't care less about material possessions, and people commented that he actually gave away a lot of his wealth. What he was passionate about was his faith in God, and then after he retired, his thousands of flowers that he lovingly tended to every year. Once he stepped back from his role and went to enjoy retirement, he actually would plant over 600 bulbs every year in his garden in Lancaster and hundreds of flowering shrubs, and then he would open the gardens every year to the public so that they could walk around and enjoy all the beauty from his meticulous hard work. And this is what really brought him joy. So in 1986, he bragged that over 6,000 people had signed the guest book for his little self-made garden show.
In 1986?
Yes, so the year after the explosion.
That's suspect.
So I don't know how many of those 6,000 people were there for the gawks more than the flowers.
Yeah.
But it made Harry happy, and honestly, after everything I've read about Harry, I like Harry.
Yeah, Harry does sound pretty awesome.
So Harry's two daughters, Margaret and Janet Lee, grew up comfortably but not lavishly in Baltimore. And then when she graduated from high school, Margaret entered college at Goucher College in Baltimore, majoring in biology. Now, in 1941, Margaret was in her junior year of college, and she met a man named Edward Benson, and people that knew him called him Benny, and they fell in love. Now, Benny didn't have the same kind of life Margaret had. He wasn't poor, but he'd had polio as a child, which had left him bedridden for an extended period of time. And he had started college, but his father became disabled, so he was forced to withdraw so that he could take care of his family and get a job to help support them after his father became disabled. In addition, his father was reportedly a raging alcoholic, and Benny was usually the one that went out of his way to take care of his father, not just financially, but also physically take care of his father. And there's stories about he would go and take Margaret out for dates, and then when he got back to drop her off after their dates, he would use their phone to call around and find out where his dad was drinking so he could go and get him and make sure he was home safe.
He's a good boy.
He was. But, you know, it shows that from an early age, he had a history of taking care of people that were making less than ideal decisions, and we're going to see that really continue throughout his life. Now, in 1942, the U.S. entered World War II, and Benny joined the military. Now, Margaret was still a student at Goucher College, but that December, Benny asked Margaret to marry him.
What branch did he join?
He was Air Force.
Huh.
So they got married in Texas, and after a brief honeymoon, Margaret returned to finish her final year at Goucher. And then when she finished college, she was actually offered a full scholarship to get her master's degree, but instead she decided that she didn't want to continue pursuing her education. She wanted to be with her new husband, so she became a military wife. Now, Benny wasn't shipped overseas because remember he'd had polio, so he was sort of a smaller man and didn't have as much stamina as other men apparently.
But you said he was in the Air Force.
But he said like a true Navy brat.
Zing.
So, anyway, Benny's job was to train other men to go overseas and fight. So he never actually went overseas during the war to fight, but they did move around the United States a lot, and Margaret was your typical military wife. On July 8th, 1944, while they were stationed at Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, they welcomed their first child, Carol Lynn Benson. Now, when Benny was discharged from the military at the end of the war, the family returned to Baltimore, and Harry offered Benny a position within the Lancaster Leaf Tobacco Company. So Benny moved his family to Lancaster, and at some point, Margaret's sister, Janet Lee, and her family also settled in Lancaster, right around the corner from Margaret and Benny. And then later, when Harry retired, he would also move to Lancaster into the same neighborhood. So they're sort of like building a little
urban commune.
Something like that. On July 26, 1951, Margaret and Benny became parents for the second time to Stephen Wayne Benson. Benny and his father-in-law Harry both hoped that one day Stephen would continue the Lancaster Leaf family dynasty and take over the company.
You see that ashtray over there, boy? Someday everything you put in that ashtray will be all yours.
Now, Benny had a really good mind for business, and before long he was climbing the ladder at Lancaster Leaf so successfully that Harry was comfortable retiring in 1959 and completely turning over the reins to Benny. In 1967, with Benny at the helm, something incredibly lucrative happened. Now, Benny had expanded Lancaster Leaf into an international company. So, in 1967, Lancaster Leaf's parent company took that stock and converted it to the stock of the parent company at a 1-to-1 ratio. So the stock that had been stock for a small privately held company was suddenly blue chip stock on a publicly traded market and was exceptionally valuable. So suddenly, Margaret, Janet Lee, and their mother Charlotte were sitting on a gold mine.
Well, that's quite fortunate.
That is. And we're going to leave them sitting on that gold mine because this is where we're going to wrap up episode 1.
That's it?
That's it for today.
No mental scars?
You didn't think the bombing was scarring enough?
Oh, yeah. I guess I blocked that out already.
But next episode, you can rest assured there's going to be a lot of mental scars.
I should put my therapist on speed dial.
The kind from childhood that live with you forever.
We still don't know why this guy's Lotus was exploding.
We don't know why the Lotus was exploding.
We have a lot to learn.
We do. Next week we're going to talk about Carolyn and Stephen and Scott's childhood. And I got to tell you, Scott is quite the wild child. His childhood is colorful.
You really dug into this. Like, you know this guy's whole childhood?
I do. I can even tell you the name of all his girlfriends. I won't, but I could.
Do you know his AOL password?
I don't. Was AOL a thing by 85?
No.
Yeah.
You know his mother's maiden name, though? You could get it.
Yeah. His mother's maiden name was Hitchcock.
Makes sense. Harry Hitchcock is badass. That's a cool name.
Yeah, we're gonna go through like a lot. We're gonna go through a lot of what hijinks Scott got into as a young man, and like I'm only gonna hit some highlights of the 5 years before.
Hijinks.
Yeah, hijinks.
You're like my third grade teacher. Don't get any shenanigans.
We're gonna go through just the 5 years before the explosion. We're just gonna go through like a quick list of some of the shenanigans, and it is prime. It's gonna be prime entertainment.
I have the whole seat here, but I'm only using the edge.
I never know how to end these.
This is the end. First, I can't say I hate my own name even. Jerry sounds nice. I'm Jerry, the co-pilot on the shit Swizzler. Let's go. I'm so excited to hear the story you have been researching.
Wow. This is going to take a long time.
Why do I read my own writing like a robot?
I wonder if they can hear the cats growling in the background.
Probably. I'm here to things up. I'm a fart cherry.
I think we should go with that.
I'm really interested to hear.
I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
I was totally gonna nail it that time. That's on you.
One fart cherry and I'm done.
Nice. What are you doing later?